All right. Let's get it.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Thanks, you.
Hello to you all. Jump out, making it. Welcome to Majors and Quinn. Before we get started, here's the obligatory reminder to silence your cell phone, lest it ring and embarrass you. My name is Michael. I'm a bookseller here at Majors and Quinn. Thank you so much for coming tonight to hear Chris Cander discuss her new novel, The Young of Other Animals. Chris will be in discussion with Mark Haber, and after their conversation, we'll have the opportunity for you to ask whatever you'd like. Then Chris will be available to sign books on the glass counter near the front of the store. Finally, just a quick note that by purchasing a book, you are not only supporting a wonderful writer, but also a local independent bookstore. Chris Cander is the USA Today best-selling author of A Gracious Neighbor, The Weight of a Piano, which was named an Indie Next Great Read in both hardcover and paperback, and which the New York Times called immense, intense, and imaginative. Whisper Hollow, also named an Indie Next Great Read, and 11 Stories, named by Kirkus as one of the best books of 2013 and winner of the Independent Publishers Book Award for Fiction. She also wrote the children's book The Word Burglar and the Audible originals Eddies and Grieving Conversations. Her new novel, The Young of Other Animals, arrived February 1st, 2024. Cander's fiction has been published in 12 languages. Later we can guess which 12. She lives in her native Houston with her husband and 2 children. Mark Haber was born, on the other hand, in Washington, D.C., and grew up in Florida. His debut novel, Reinhardt's Garden, was published by Coffeehouse Press and nominated for the 2020 Penn Hemingway Award for debut novel. His second novel, St. Sebastian's Abyss, was published in 2022 by Coffeehouse Press and called a sparkling comic novel by the New York Times, as well as being named a Best Book of Fiction 2022 by the New York Public Library. Mark's third book, Lesser Ruins, will be published by Coffeehouse Press in 2024. The galleys have just appeared. Mark's fiction has appeared in Guernica, the Southwest Review, Lit Hub, and Airlight. Mark lives in Minneapolis, where he remains devilishly handsome.
Thank you.
Please join me in welcoming Mark and Chris. You think seated feels like the right move?
I think seated feels
Yeah.
totally great. In fact, I think you guys should just like stand up and maybe spread out a little bit.
Nice
We
and
don't
intimate.
keep it too
Yeah.
formal. I love this actually. I'm just so grateful to see all of these wonderful, familiar faces. To meet you guys. I love it. But I mean, it makes me so happy. Thank you all for supporting me. I mean, it means so much to me. Thank you.
So I can start talking about the book, asking you questions if you'd like, and we'll just go from there. And of course, keep it casual. If someone has a burning question or wants to interject or ask, I think that's,
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think that, we can.
we don't have to stand on ceremony.
No, we don't have
Yeah,
to stand on
yeah.
ceremony.
Well, first of all, I just want to say congratulations. I think we were speaking earlier, this is your 5th novel,
Yeah.
which is like incredible. It's an incredible novel. It has this momentum. If you haven't read it, it's a thriller, but it's a literary thriller. And when I say literary, I mean everyone has their own definition. I just think that there's a craft, there's a care about the words that you use. It's not just trying to get from A to B. There's that thoughtfulness about the language that's used. And I loved it. So congratulations. I loved it when I reread it. And so I guess I'll just start by saying it's a book that takes place in Texas. You, as Michael mentioned, are a Houston, Texas native. And I was going to ask, Texas and Austin, where it takes place, is basically a character in this book. And we'll get to time and the period it takes place. But as far as Texas being a character, how did Texas as a kind of character inform your story as place, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's funny because I had never set, well, the first book I set in Houston
Right.
was the last one, A Gracious Neighbor. And the experience of writing that, because it was so familiar to me, was kind of enchanting, and it made me hungry for a little bit more, to go into a little bit more depth and explore my home state in a way that I hadn't in literature before, or in writing before.
Yeah.
I mean, I love Texas. The politics, not so much, but the culture, the history, the lore, the whole idea of everything being bigger in Texas.
And you get it. I mean, I lived there for the last 11 years, so I can
Yeah.
tell you, living in Houston, that there's so many things, and we could get into details, but whether it's, Tex-Mex or just an expression that you nail so well. I mean, I think you could only nail it that way, being a native.
Yeah, thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
It was really fun because having worked so hard to understand characters or understand settings in other books, this was really not as hard.
Sure,
You
it
know,
became
it was
natural,
it
yeah.
was really natural, and I know writers that focus on their own region. I can understand why people do that for a reason.
Yeah,
And I think I'm going to stay in Texas
I love
in
it.
fiction for a little while because there's
Yeah.
so much to explore, not only from a contemporary standpoint but from an historical standpoint.
Yeah. You
So-
could look back in like 10 years and the next book's Texas, go, yeah, that was my Texas trilogy. Those
Right.
are my 3 books
My
that I
3
took.
Texas.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
going through, I love that.
A little Larry McMurtry moment.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. There was one question I was going to ask a little bit later, but it feels so connected to this question that I'm going to ask, is that time period. So Texas is the setting, but the time period you also get so well, and it's hard because the 80s, the 90s, the 80s really, late 80s, there aren't these things that have come to inform our lives, but also fiction, whether it's the internet or the cell phone. And so I was going to ask about how you captured those things that we know, people that are, maybe not 30. Whether it's Blockbuster or voice, leaving a voicemail on a landline. So was that a challenge, or was it kind of freeing to go, oh, I can't do this because we didn't have the internet then?
I really like, I don't know about you as readers, but I really like reading books that don't, that seem in some ways kind of timeless, even though they are anchored in time.
Sure.
And I feel like things that are set right now,
Mhm.
or in an immediate, more recent time frame, feel like they're going to be easily dated, just because technology changes so quickly that I really prefer not having too much of that in the story.
Yeah. It's almost like a timestamp,
It
and
really
then 2
is a
weeks later it's
timestamp.
expired. Yeah.
Whereas in 1989, I mean, it's forever ago, and yet, the technology was advancing, but it was still not as advanced as it is. Like if I set a book today,
Mhm.
it would seem really dated in 5 years.
No, absolutely, yeah. And in this book, it's 1989, but it could just as easily have been really 1970.
Right.
Everything that takes place could have been 20 years earlier.
And it was fun to think back on that time, and I guess I'll probably blend into what is one of your questions is going to be about why I wrote this book.
Yes,
So
oh yeah.
maybe I'll just flow into that.
Go
from
right
here.
ahead, please.
But 1989 was a time that I remember very well for certain reasons. But it was fun to research it too, and just to
Yeah.
go back and think about. And I love the internet for this, to be able to say, what commercials were playing in 1989. And I did this deep dive into what the daytime television schedule was on public television,
Yeah.
and they have that on the internet.
Wow.
Because Mayrie, she digs herself
Her stories.
her stories
Right.
and her Price is Right.
Yeah.
And, and I thought that was really fun to be able to go back and think, yeah, I remember that.
That's incredible.
So I loved writing the time period,
Yeah.
but it's also because the thing that the inciting incident for this book was a terrible incident that happened to me in 1989, and some of you know this story already, so I don't have to go into great detail, but I was studying abroad and I was kidnapped and held at knife point and almost murdered, and I was able to escape, and it was right at the end of this study term, and so I was able to just bury it. I made it back to Madrid, where I had been at a restaurant, and I didn't want to tell anybody about what happened. I was fortunate that the one friend that I had been with and who was very reluctant to see me walking away willingly with this assailant was waiting for me, and it had been hours, and I absolutely blacked out that whole period of time. I couldn't tell you where I went to school, what I studied, who I met, where I lived. I literally have a big black box where that fits in. And yet I remember some of the immediate periphery's gone, but I remember that event so well.
Right.
And because I never talked about it to anyone, I thought I was doing a pretty good job of having it just not be a part of my life.
Right.
But looking back on my life, I realized that it's defined almost everything about me. And, I became a competitive bodybuilder, and I was a firefighter, and I was a martial artist, and a self-defense expert, and a weapons expert. And I did all of those things not consciously recognizing that I was trying to turn myself into a weapon so that nothing like that would ever happen to me again.
But in hindsight, it was that
it all made sense.
Right.
So when I was finished with A Gracious Neighbor and I was thinking about the next project, my eldest, Sasha, who is now 21, was exactly the age I was when I was attacked. And she was planning her cross-country trip home for the summer. She goes to school in Connecticut. And I think that it just, something in me thought, all of those fears were activated again, even though I felt like she was very strong. I felt like I had been very strong, and yet I was vulnerable, and she would be vulnerable. And I just thought it was time to write about it. And I didn't ever have any interest in doing it in memoir form or essay form. I wanted to keep a little distance between me and that event. It's easier to talk about now. It's still not really easy to talk about. So by setting it in Austin, which was closer to home, that made me feel, psychically a little safer looking at it. Paula, the protagonist, and her mother, Mayrie, who I did not have any idea was going to show up in the story as she did, but boy, she made herself an entrance. But I started with Paula, and I gave her my birthday, and I gave her a name that resembled Paige, my middle name, and this really horrible night in 1989.
Yeah.
And so, that goes back to your original question about the time.
Right.
So I wanted to honor the reason that I was writing the book by setting it in that year.
Yes.
But I wanted to fictionalize virtually everything else except for the attack itself.
Yeah. Well, it's an achievement because you're taking something that's based in your life and you turn it into fiction, into this incredible novel. But all the important ideas that you want to be there are there, whether it's the friendship between women, mother and daughter, neighbors, peers. The friendship between, Missy and Paula is so powerful and so strong, as is the complex, flawed relationship between your protagonist, Paula, and her mom, Mayrie. It's very complex, it's very real, and that's a question I was going to get to, but you do kind of pay tribute to this real thing that happened to you, and you do it through literature, which is incredible.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. There was another question I was going to ask. It'll come to me in a second about that. But can you talk a little bit about the characters in this book? And this does tie in with what you're saying, in that Paula and Mayrie and all these the main characters of this book. I mean, Paula is the protagonist, but there's 3 or 4 really strong characters. Was it hard for you to make them so complex because they're flawed, and you see early in the book them doing things that you're like, oh, don't do that. And yet we all make bad decisions all the time, and you see them being maybe selfish or saying things that is going to hurt another character's feelings. So was that a challenge for you to make these characters like fully 3-dimensional?
I mean, first of all, thank you for the compliment.
Of course.
That they are 3-dimensional. But no, that's the joy of writing for me, is to be mean.
Yeah.
I'm actually pretty nice in person, but I can be pretty hardcore mean to my characters and put them in really uncomfortable, embarrassing situations.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that the joy of reading something? Because you're just getting to try on an experience that thankfully you don't have to actually do in your real life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the same thing about writing it. It's just pushing that a little bit beyond comfort.
Yeah.
And to where the point where you're a little, like even me as a writer, I'm a little squeamish about,
right.
Oh,
right.
man,
Are you going too
you're
far?
gonna do
right.
that?
Yeah.
And yes, and actually Charlie and I were talking at lunch the other day about the fact that writing, I tend to love to write about the villains. I mean, to write the villains in their voice.
Yeah.
They come to me more clearly.
Yeah.
And writing Mayrie was so easy.
She came to you. The
she
voice
just
just
came to me.
yeah.
She announced her presence.
Yeah.
Paula, I started with her,
Yeah.
but it took me a while to find her voice
Yeah.
and her personality because, you know, I met her in the aftermath of this tragedy.
Right.
And then I had to go back and build her story in
Sure.
order to understand who she was. But Mayrie just blasted onto the
Fully
stage,
fleshed,
fully
yeah.
formed,
Right.
and in her big, messy
Yeah.
life and her Texas drawl
Yeah.
and her chain smoking.
Well, and it's great because for all their flaws, they're very. I mean, these main characters are very. You come to care about them a lot. Not just despite their flaws, maybe because of their flaws, you know. And they're very strong characters, and you see the mistakes they've made. I don't want to give anything away, but with Mayrie, and her past, and maybe she's not mother of the year. She's probably not the best mom in the world. But you are like, but what mom is? I mean, everyone is just doing their best, you know.
Right.
And that's the complexity of the novel, which is so delicious. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, of
Thank
course.
you. I'd
Absolutely.
like to give just a shout out to my mom, who isn't here. She's at home in Texas. I hope that nobody ever thinks that I'm writing autobiographically about my mother,
Yeah.
because my mother is amazing. And had I told her what happened to me,
Right.
and I didn't until the book was finished and turned in, and that was a very challenging conversation because it gutted her to learn that I had experienced this and that I had carried it around, and she would have loved to have helped me navigate it, but I didn't give her the chance to do it.
So your mom literally didn't know about this event until recently.
No.
Wow.
In fact, there was a point where I was writing the book and she said, Chris, tell me what you're working on again. And I said, oh, you know, I'm writing about that thing that happened in Spain. And she said, what thing that happened in Spain? And I thought, oh shit. That's right. I told you.
Tapas.
Yeah. And I realized that no, I mean, I had just utterly forgotten that I didn't tell her because
Yeah.
I hadn't told anybody.
Right.
So,
Wow.
but she was great. I had to dole it out in, you know, a few sentences at a time, let her
Sure.
digest it,
Yeah.
and she did, and
Yeah.
she's, you know,
Yeah.
she's comfortable now. She knows I can take care of myself.
Well, it's also really great to see the differences between, I mean, what happened to you, which is terrible, but the dichotomy between you and your family relationships and the difference between that and the book. And just how when you're writing fiction, you kind of choose, well, I want to do this, I don't want to do that, and you know, because writing's all about decisions. You know,
Right.
which decisions you're going to do. Is it going to be Dallas in 1950? No, it's going to be Austin 1989, and obviously the date is significant. But another question I wanted to ask, and this reminds me, this most recent book, The Young of Other Animals, of your previous book, in that the pacing is really, really great. There's this momentum, having trouble saying momentum, that really carries the reader along. And I was wondering if that was a challenge as far as pacing, or did it just kind of come to you? Because the chapters are told by different perspective. Well, it's all third person, but it's told with a focus on either Paula or Mayrie, basically. And was pacing the book difficult? Did you feel like you had to take a lot out because it slowed it down, or did it kind of come as we read it?
No, it came as we read it.
Yeah.
I mean, I really just started on page 1.
Yeah.
And, well, no, that's not true. I actually wrote out, I don't want to give too much away.
Sure.
So in order to get through the psychic hiccup of writing about the attack itself, I had to write that all out first. But I didn't want that to be front-loaded because I thought that would turn the reader off.
Yeah.
So where I wrote it, and then I locked off the attack itself and started with Paula escaping.
That's, to me, so smart.
And I saved it. I did use it, but the rest of it was just, you know, from that moment forward. I literally wrote it chronologically to the end. And I decided when Mayrie came to me and was so strong and so clear, it made me want to give her equal airtime.
Yeah.
And so the binary structure seemed really natural. And in terms of the pacing, I never feel like I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So the answer to the question is, I I have no idea how I did it.
Yeah.
This just happened.
It's
and
just
I-
kind of, you're building the bridge as you cross it.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly right.
Well, it's incredible, and it's funny how a character can kind of speak to you, like Mayreen goes, no, I want more airtime. I deserve to be heard, and these characters come and they have so much to say.
Right.
And you're like, no, they're demanding I do this, and I've found that with some stories I've done or something I've written that they want to stay on the stage,
Right.
and you've got to kind of you've got to indulge them,
Yes.
you know, and it's usually great when you do that. So
Katya was like that in The Weight of a Piano. I didn't know that Katya was going to be as prominent
yeah,
in that story as she was, and she too seemed to have a whole lot to say. And then A Gracious Neighbor, which is between those two,
Yeah.
was told entirely through Martha's point of view,
Right.
and that I found to be challenging because it was, you know, the reader was seeing the world as she saw it, as an unreliable narrator,
right,
and having to decide for themselves if she was perceiving things correctly. So I liked the balance between Paula and Mayree
Yeah.
and getting the different views of their experience of this one tragic week
Yes.
in their lives, and
Yeah.
then bringing in some backstory
yeah.
to balance out Mayree's side of it.
And that's what's so great about this book. I mean, it all takes place from like a Saturday to a Saturday, all in 1 week. It's all kind of bookended by these Saturdays, which is fantastic. Did you have any like strong books or writers, like influences while you were writing this, or something that you were trying to not emulate, but aim for? Like, you know, like you mentioned Larry McMurtry, but was
Yeah.
there something like just some books that you read that informed you writing this, or was it just? I mean, it's a very Chris Cander book, so it
Thank
feels like you, but I thought there might be things that really spoke to you while you were writing it.
I think that the only one that really comes to mind is Terms of Endearment. I had reread it early in the pandemic, and the mother-daughter relationship, I mean, certainly I didn't set out to emulate that, but I'm sure I was heavily influenced.
Yeah, even
By-
unconsciously.
Yeah, unconsciously by their relationship, you know, because my relationship with my mother is not fraught.
Right.
But I think I pulled some of that energy between
Yeah.
those characters in his novel and put them into mine.
It's really a great relationship, and I don't think you realize as a reader until you're done with the book. And when I say it's great, I don't mean it's great like it's an ideal relationship, mother-daughter. It's not ideal in any way, but it's great how you do it because, you know, these are people, like a lot of our lives in our family, you want what's best for the other person, but you don't always go about it the best way, you know? And you end up maybe hurting that person or saying something when all you want is for them to, you know, be happy. But it doesn't
Yeah.
work that way, unfortunately.
Well, and also it's, you know, the idea of generational trauma, of
Yes.
the things that we bring into these
Yes.
new relationships
Yeah.
that, you know, clearly that's a huge theme in this story. is
Absolutely.
how-
Yeah, that's something I haven't touched on, but that's
Yeah,
huge.
the way that it, you know, you can break cycles, hopefully,
Yeah.
the bad ones.
Right.
But the programming is there,
Yeah. That's really
good or bad, you know.
yeah. Which brings me to there is generational trauma with a couple characters, and I'm trying to do this and not give anything away. There's lots of surprises toward the end. Well, as you're going along, but definitely towards the end, like things happen like, I did not expect that. As an author, did they surprise you as well, usually? Because I know, like, you and I have spoken about this, and we kind of, we write by the seat of our pants.
Yeah.
We like to kind of invent as we go along, and we don't really plot out. So were you kind of pleasantly surprised by, like, because you kind of write yourself sometimes into a corner, and then you figure it out, and you're
Yes.
like, oh, that's,
Oh, and it's such a relief when
Yeah.
you figure it out.
Yeah.
You know, there's that panic where you think, oh God, I have to throw this away.
Yeah,
and
there's
I
no way
can't-
out.
There's no way out.
yeah. So did the surprises for the reader also surprise you as the author?
Yes,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
And when I get into that tricky corner
Yeah.
that I tend to find myself in,
Right.
one of the tools that I use that helps me navigate my way out is that I'm really fastidious about timelines. And I actually plot everything on a timeline.
Okay. Yeah.
So that I can see how I would have to, the dates and ages that an event would have
Yes.
to happen. Like I'm trying also not to give anything
Right.
away.
Yeah, things become more important.
Right.
Yeah.
So I have to think, okay, well, if this thing happened here,
Right.
how old would everybody be, and what
Yeah.
point in the relationship, and when did the betrayal start, and how
Right.
old would that person be now? So When I start to feel a little threatened, I go for the analytical stuff, and that helps me.
That maybe sometimes provides like
It does. It's like a release valve.
Yeah.
For the
That's
panic,
really cool.
and then it allows a solution to
Yeah.
work its way in.
That's really cool because, like if my wife and I are watching like a police procedural, and sometimes she'll go, "Oh, that's the guy. He's the one that started the fires," and we'll kind of call it. And with this book, not that I was trying to. I'm not always naturally going. I don't naturally want to figure it out. I just want to be kind of adrift on the story, and I'll find out as I find out. But if I even wanted to, I wouldn't have kind of figured out the things that do happen toward the end. I'm like, wow, okay, wow, I was not expecting that, which is great. I mean, that's a really a great testament to the skill.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course, you're welcome. I know I'm trying to ask you a question and like, ease up on the compliments. I don't want you to get too comfortable. So I guess this is really the last formal question I have. I know I think of some more. These are just ones I wrote down, but as we said, this is your 5th novel. And of course you've got a children's book, and you've got the 12 stories, which is a novel with stories as well. How do you see this book in kind of your growing body of work? How do you think it places? I don't mean is it the best or the middle, but how do you think it speaks to the other books, or does it not?
So funny, we were just talking about this too.
Oh really? Yeah, just in your, because you start to maybe look back in hindsight and go, well, where is this figure in the other things?
Well, I literally asked Charlie exactly this question.
Oh
because
wow.
I was curious about whether the last 2 books were set apart from the first 3 in some way. And I love your answer. Can I paraphrase it?
Sure.
Yeah.
But I don't think I'll do it as eloquently as you did. But
Go ahead.
the idea was that whatever obsession or trauma that the protagonist was dealing with in those first 3 books was externalized, symbolically externalized.
Yeah.
And in these 2, A Gracious Neighbor and this one, they are internal. So it's very much inside the heads of the characters, and they're processing their traumas without having a symbol outside of it that they can operate on. Did I?
Yeah, and they're weighted down.
Yeah.
They're weighted down by what's happened to them and what their obsessions are.
Yeah, that's I think you nailed it, yeah. Also, speaking of A Gracious Neighbor, there's a really clever kind of meta moment, or kind of a shout out to your previous book in the book, which I think is great, and there's like a newspaper article in a short story that does exist, and I thought that was just a really great like wink to the reader.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
just
love to
so
do
good.
that. I love to do that. It's so fun because,
Yeah.
and not, people don't always get it, but.
No, but if you're
Yeah.
paying attention, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they, actually Laura gave me this idea, my friend right there, but my last novel that came out, the acknowledgements, I think, this, center, this kind of, residency, this artist residency that doesn't exist in the Berkshires, and it's a setting of my new novel. So in the acknowledgements of the last one, it ends up, and so Laura said, well, I was figuring out my acknowledgements recently. She goes, oh, you should do that. And I'm like, that's right. So the next book that's already done, but it's a novella, smart, I decided to think this country, this fictional place where it takes place. So, yeah, so there's and these are little winks in the acknowledgements. It doesn't mean anything, but little breadcrumbs, so.
Oh yeah, I loved it. I mean, I had I do it in all of them. In The Weight of a Piano, I had the movers of the piano they were chosen because they had worked on the movie set of 11 Stories. And so, so I just keep throwing in some little something in there.
Well, and you want to have fun. It's not meant to be, you take it seriously, but at the same time you want to have fun with the reader and have fun with the work.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And none of my books are connected in any other way.
Right,
So
same here.
this little daisy chain of references is kind of fun.
Yeah, it is. It's great. It's great.
Thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It was I really enjoyed rereading it a lot just recently because I knew we'd be in conversation. I guess we can open it up to questions from the audience if they'd like.
Yeah, or
comments.
refills of wine.
Yeah.
Good question. Were you afraid, I mean, you mentioned how you kind of front-loaded, getting that part out of the way so that it would be out of the way and then you would start and go forward as kind of a way of controlling that experience for yourself, but like writing fiction is such a trust exercise, and then you were you afraid that you would like lose control, like feel something you didn't wanna feel, or remember something you didn't wanna remember, or anything, you know, in letting go to write this book?
You know, I did actually feel that feeling, and so when I wrote that section, and it was, you know, 9 pages or something, I don't know how many pages it was, I poured myself a really strong cocktail. It was a beautiful day, and I went outside and sat on my in my backyard with the gate open. And I know this sounds really weird, as though if I needed to flee, I could flee. And I wanted my family there, but occupied so that they wouldn't interrupt me. So I wanted to feel this blurry sense of, I don't know, what is the word I'm looking for? Connection with that memory, with the cocktail. And then I also wanted to feel safe. I wanted that sense of physical safety around me. And not that I would have actually gotten up and run from my own house, but I sat down with that fear inside of me that I needed to be ready for anything, as though the assailant would actually somehow materialize and show up right there. So it was kind of a traumatic experience. And then when it was done, the great news is that it was really cathartic to have written it down, because I'd never done that before, and not in the detail that I did. And so I felt when he didn't show up and didn't materialize, and I didn't spontaneously combust, I felt like, okay, this is gonna be fine. I can do this. The hardest part is done. The rest of the hard part of writing a novel is just gonna be the same difficulty that any novel is. And it was a release in a lot of ways. I think writing through Paula's story in this, you know, window of a week, and Mayree's, which reflects back on her entire life, gave me an opportunity to mother myself through that trauma, because I was both close to the age that Mayree was in the novel, and also able to, you know, remember being 19 and having that just happen. So it was an opportunity for me to forgive myself for the guilt I carried around all that time for having gone willingly with someone who then turned on me. I berated myself for years for being stupid and trusting someone that I didn't know, and, you know, taking this unnecessary risk. And I was able to give myself permission to let that go and realize that, you know, it was a moment in my life, but it's turned out really well. I've been able to teach self-defense to thousands of women, and so, you know, that probably wouldn't have been part of my life if I hadn't experienced what I did. And now in writing this book and reaching readers, you know, a lot of people have contacted me about their stories, and a lot of people have been asking me about, you know, taking my self-defense classes. So it is an opportunity to contribute to the ongoing conversation about violence against women. That was a very long answer.
No, thank you.
When you get a character like Mary who's very bold,
Yes.
are you always able to stay in control of her, or does she surprise you and sometimes come forth with something that's so powerful that you have to redirect your writing?
Well, I definitely feel like Mayree led me around by the nose the whole time. And, you know, even in her quiet moments, you know, there was such a charged, pent-up fury inside of her that I could viscerally feel. And so even when she wasn't full of dialogue and action, even if it was just the chain smoking or throwing all of her clothes on the floor, I felt like she was directing me and not the other way around. So I was very happy that she led the way.
Is she the first character that has come on so strong before?
No, I've had other ones. I think that Charlie and I talked about this. Murthan in Whisper Hollow came on really strong. I mean, her diabolical personality, I don't know, just all of the duplicitousness that she lived with. This idea of living as a nun and being this really sort of damaged, wicked person surprised me a lot and was very strong in my imagination. And again, Katya in the Riva Piano, being a refusenik, coming to this country as a Soviet Jew. You know, I didn't expect that to happen. So I'm very delighted that these people are willing to enter my imagination and co-create with me, because I give them a lot of credit. I don't think I can do this without some sort of magical intervention. I don't know how it works.
I think you're directing the magic so well done.
Thank you, thank you. And
What kind of revisions did you have to do with this book? I mean, I read it in an earlier version, and I'm just curious, with these sorts of materials, which are, some of them are very hard to handle, revision then becomes a pretty delicate operation.
Yeah. I had my editor and another editor, both were working on it at the end after I turned in the first draft. But I had done a lot of work between the drafts that you read on my own, just wanting to flesh out the relationships a little bit more intensely. And I don't even remember what changed exactly. But one thing that was a pretty significant aspect of the editing process was the sensitivity read. Because this was 1989, it was Texas. There's a black housekeeper who plays a really important role in the lives of these women. And because of the, you know, where we are now in our culture, it might have been considered, some people considered it indelicate of me to have a black character play this subservient role, and even suggested that I change her race. And you know, it's kind of an interesting experiment to think about, where am I willing to go? I'm not willing to do an anachronistic edit for the sake of our current needs. I want to be sensitive always, but I also wanted to be true to the time and place. And so I did go and make some additional edits to that relationship, especially at the end. And I'm not saying that it was right, but I don't think it was true that in 1989, white employers, even those that really loved their employees of color, were as reflective of the role that they played in their lives. So I had to be a little bit delicate. I wanted to do that as a reference to where we are in our culture now, but not make it seem like I was creating, falsifying reality in 1989. Now, I wish that it had been true that back then people were more sensitive, and even further behind, back in history than that. But that was a tough part of the editing process, was trying to figure out that balance. But I think it worked out okay. I hope so.
I noticed in the acknowledgements that you gave your real friend the same name
Yes.
as, except then in the beginning chapters, how that friend responds as sort of like not great. And so I was curious about that, how your real friend felt about that,
So
what those choices were.
I love that you bring that up, because that has a story with a happy ending. So when I told you that this event or this episode happened, and I made it back to Madrid, Kelly was waiting for me, and then my memory goes blank. It's like a curtain dropped, and I even forgot Kelly's last name. I mean, we went back to the United States, and we were at the same school, but we hadn't really been friends before we were in Spain together, and so I had no reason to continue to seek her out. And as I was, thinking about all of this, I wanted that anchor. I could never remember her name. And so I put her in there as a way of connecting her to the story. And I didn't know when I started out that Kelly, in the fictional Kelly, was going to actually do the kind of things that she did. And if I had known that, I probably would have gone back and changed her name. But I got all the way to the end, and we were in the final edits when I found her, the real Kelly. I found her. A clever friend of mine said, "Why don't you go look at the yearbooks?" And I thought, yearbooks? We had yearbooks in college? And so I did. I went to the university library and searched for Kelly, and oh my gosh, there she was in all her big hair glory. And I saw her last name, and I thought, of course that's her last name. And because of the magic of Facebook, I was able to find her.
Oh my gosh.
And she was in Galveston, which is, a coastal town about 45 miles away from us, and had been there all along. And so I was able to reach out and make contact with her, and it so happened that she didn't immediately write back. And so I didn't know that she wanted to talk to me, and so I didn't change the name when I had the chance. But ultimately, she reached out, and we got together, and we had this amazing reunion. And what was really validating, as awful as it was, is that I remembered everything about that attack correctly. Because when I asked her to tell me what she remembered, it was exactly as I had apparently described it immediately to her, and then never talked about it again. And because I was a little worried as I was writing the book, like, what if I made this whole thing up?
Yeah.
This whole thing was a big fat lie that I dreamed and
Right.
somehow internalized as real.
Right.
And so it was kind of a relief for her to say, no, this is exactly what happened. You stumbled out of the bushes and your shirt was torn and you were bleeding and you were crying. And I said, that's the only discrepancy. I didn't stumble out of any bushes. I stumbled out of the car of the old couple that brought me back. She said, there was no car. I said, yes, there was a car. It was a powder blue sedan. It was an old man, an old woman. They drove me all the way back to the city. I've always wished that I could, that I had known their names and that I had been able to thank them.
Yeah.
And she said, no, you just stepped right out of the bushes. And that is the one kind of miraculous unsolved mystery that I'll never know.
Wow.
But I could describe that ride back, and apparently it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So,
Trauma does weird things.
Yeah.
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 Wow.
I mean, there was literally no other way for me to get back.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I know. Subject for another story, maybe. Any other questions? Any more wine? Keep
All
trying
right.
to push it on people.
Terrific. Thank you guys so much. And we now have book signing if you're
Thank
so
you.
inclined.
Yeah.